Dildilian family story goes back to the 18th century, the end of the 1700s. My great-great-great-grandfather, Muradens Garabed, was a blacksmith in Sapastia, which is an ancient town in Anatolia, today called Sivas. Subsequent to that great-great-great-grandfather, then there was my great-grandfather, who was a confectioner, a grocery store owner, made sweets, and then ultimately my great-grandfather, who was a shoemaker, and then my grandfather was a photographer. So we didn't seem to stick, at least for a century, with one particular profession. Marsovan, this is where the family primarily relocated, which is about 60 miles or so south of the Black Sea in central Anatolia.
It was quite an intellectual community. Armenians had very good schools. Then the Anatolia College was established there, which became a source of inspiration probably, or enlightenment. And there was the American hospital there, very massive stone building. Good college community atmosphere, concerts, lectures, museum.
There was a lot of business at a college, their graduation photographs. Families wanted to see photographs of their children at the college. The college wanted photographs of their classes for yearbooks and publicity. So it was a good business decision to set up a studio in Marsovan. My grandfather was invited in 1894 to be the official photographer for the college. He set up a studio first near the campus. Eventually, after he got married in 1899 and started to raise his own family, he built a beautiful house, one of the largest Armenian homes, because it wasn't just a home, it was his photography studio. It was across the street from the college campus. And there's one panorama that's 360 degrees taken from the roof of this building, which was the college hospital, one of the most advanced hospitals in that whole area. And my grandfather must have gotten on the roof and shot from that vantage point 12 amazingly high-resolution photographs, including in those images, what's in that image is a photo of the family home with the window open on the third floor with my grandmother's laundry drying on the window. Discrimination goes back actually centuries. You were always second class, and you had to defer to people who were in the first class, who were the Turks. And in a particular story in the memoir of my great uncle Aram, he tells how as a young boy he was walking down the street when a Turkish imam was walking in the opposite direction, and the Turkish imam knocked him over. He fell and he cut his leg, got infected, and this got worse and worse over the years. And eventually he had to have his leg amputated. And that kind of discrimination was quite common. But the Armenians still in this period were successful economically, at least in many of the urban areas. And this in part contributed to a kind of resentment that we saw boil over at times, including in the mid-1890s when there were very extensive massacres in Sebastia and across the Armenian lands. The family's business, the shoe business, was ruined. The photography business in Marsovan was attacked. But those kinds of jealousies and a kind of nationalist Turks for the Turkey for the Turks was something that re-emerged again in the First World War, and eventually was part of the ideology that led to the Armenian Genocide. Now we're moved into 1914, 1915, beginning of the First World War. During this period, photography then played a very important role in saving the family. In particular, my grandfather was taken into the Ottoman Army, and he was a photographer in the Ottoman Army and would travel and take photographs in different locations. His parents had died in Sepastia, and he had taken over the raising of all of his siblings. He himself had gotten married, this is Solog in 1899, and started to raise his own family at the same time that he was taking care of 2 of his sisters and 3 of his brothers. Armenians in many of the urban areas were very educated and advanced in their sort of Western liberal ideas. But all of this came to a really horrific end during the deportations and the massacres that began in April and the months that followed in 1915. This deportation by this point in the summer of 1915 was pretty much sure death. He was able to save his brother Aram and his sister Haganush. His other siblings, he had a younger brother, Shamavon, and he also had a sister, Paransem. They were not in Marsovan, and as a result, they were deported, and none of them survived, and none of their children survived. Because the college, even though it was an American missionary college, half the faculty were Armenian professors, and almost many of them were killed in the genocide, and so were the majority of the students. But some of those students were rescued and hidden at the family home over this period.
There was one neighbor I know that had tortured the man. They had make him sit on a sharp wood, and they nailed him on it. But there were 2 of them. Oh, they were killed.
How do you know they were killed?
Well, they never came back, honey.
And those years of the war and the genocide, the deportations, they are attempting to rescue and save and hide dozens of young men and then also eventually young women who were either facing deportation or were deported and escaped. And they made heroic efforts to hide them.
I should say all in all 18 or 19 Armenian college students, male students, escaped. Quite a few of them went to my aunt's place and some to our place.
We had one in our house, I know. He used to hide in the attic. And we had told that if the bell rang him from, we used to tell one another, and I was the last one near him to say to hide, you know.
There's this photograph of the family and some of these escapees who were hiding in the house. They would have been executed at this point, but because they escaped from the deportation, they're celebrating Armenian Christmas secretly in the family house.
During the 2-3 years of the war, those people were kept. We had dug underground tunnels around the house. They designed periscopes. I remember one was in a swallow's nest.
This effort that the family was engaged in during the war and during the genocide to rescue and hide young Armenian men and women, this continued in another form after the war ended. And this was the great efforts that the family made with regard to the hundreds, literally thousands of orphans in the surrounding countryside. Many of those children, their parents, their elder siblings were killed, and we have hundreds and hundreds of documents from the orphanage, lists and lists of orphans, where they came from, their medical conditions, all the inventory, maps of the houses that they used for housing the orphans, the staff, how much, it's almost every scrap of paper invoice of running a business, but in this case an orphanage. But with the Turkish War of Independence and the fighting with the Greeks, these orphanages were eventually forced to close, and that happened with more massacres in the summer of 1921. 3,000 Armenians were killed in Marsovan. Our family members survived because they hid in the college campus. But by November 1922, it was clear they could not remain. They had to leave, and that's when the orphanage was closed, and they left Samsun in the Black Sea. And they were given very short notice. It was initially 24 hours, and it turned into 48 hours, and they had to gather 400 orphans.
Early in the morning, at 5 o'clock, got on the boat and the boat left. Soon afterwards, we heard that orders had arrived to detain my father, but we were on the high seas.
Just to think you're given such a short amount of time to move, to uproot your family, and there's my grandfather taking photographs on the boat as they are leaving with a sea of orphans on the deck of the ship. And one of the photographs has my grandmother in the background standing on a ladder pointing to a life preserver with the name of the ship, as if he's saying, I need to document this moment of exodus. The ship gets hit by another ship and starts taking on water, and they have to bail out as they're going into the Aegean. And in this chaos on board, trying to keep the ship from sinking, the Greek orphans are unsupervised, and they take one of the Dildilian family trunks and throw it overboard. And Armen says in his memoir, this was the trunk where I had my stamp collection and my postcard collection. And many of the postcards that were Dildilian photograph postcards were thrown overboard. But they eventually made it to Greece. All the Armenians were quarantined on an island with very little food and support. And this was the last time that the family was together as a large unit. So by the end of 1923, part of the family was in France, part of the family was in California. My mother and grandfather and her two brothers remained in Greece. So this is part of what is typical of Armenians and we call the diaspora. This story that I've been telling about the family, it is obviously family history, a family story, it's a personal story. It's a story that has been with me all my life, from a childhood when I would hear bits and pieces of the story to later on in my life when I was given the privilege of access to these memoirs and to the photography archive. My view is once there's a crack in this erasure and this denial of the history, you can never really close it up again. You can never close the door. And I think over the last decade, these cracks have gotten wider and wider, and more people in Turkey are aware of what happened to the Armenians and the Greeks. When I teach in human rights issues, I always try to bring in the human element, the particular story. That's how we often are able to access people, where they can see that these were people that weren't all that different from us. There is something greater than just the story itself. There is a message, I think, that these stories tell and that my family tells. They were the ones who tried their hardest to keep alive their story and to document it. And it's been my privilege over the years to share it with others in different venues, in different formats. And I hope to continue that for the rest of my life.